My sister claimed I was a danger to my own kids, so I made sure she lost custody. I'm a 34-year-old single father with two amazing kids, my 8-year-old son and my 5-year-old daughter. Life hasn't always been easy, but I've worked hard to build a stable and happy home for us. My sister Gabriella is 37, married to Rodrigo, and they have two kids, a 10-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. On paper, Gabriella's life looks perfect: a 6-figure corporate job, a big house in the suburbs, and a husband who seems to have everything under control. But trust me, it's not as perfect as it seems. Gabriella and I were never close. Growing up, she was the golden child who followed all the rules, got perfect grades, and made our parents proud. Meanwhile, I was the rebellious kid who questioned authority, made mistakes, and according to our parents, gave them gray hairs. Gabriella loved to rub her success in my face. Even back then, she was the kind of sister who would ace a test and leave it out where I could see it, just to remind me how easy it was for her to be perfect. Our relationship didn't improve much in adulthood. Gabriella has always had this superiority complex. She likes to pretend she's offering helpful advice, but it's always thinly veiled criticism of my choices. When I decided to become a freelance graphic designer, she called it a hobby job and asked if I had thought about the kind of example I was setting for my kids. When my son chose dance over soccer, Gabriella acted like I had condemned him to a life of bullying. Don't even get me started on the time she asked if I was saving for therapy because my daughter's favorite color was black instead of pink. That's just Gabriella. The last family gathering was where everything started to fall apart. It was a backyard barbecue at our parents' house, a rare occasion when everyone showed up. My kids were running around with their cousins, laughing and having a great time. But of course, Gabriella had to make a loud comment for everyone to hear. She said something about how I let my kids run wild and how it's no surprise they never listen to anyone. I laughed it off at the moment because I've learned not to let her get under my skin. But I could feel Rodrigo's judgmental side-eye, probably mentally comparing my parenting to their color-coded chore charts and strict screen time schedules. Gabriella and Rodrigo are the definition of helicopter parents. Their kids aren't allowed to eat sugar, stay up past 7:30 p.m., or watch anything that isn't educational. Rodrigo is always posting Pinterest-worthy pictures of family game nights or homemade science projects. But their kids always look exhausted. It's like they're being raised in a pressure cooker. Meanwhile, Gabriella treats motherhood like a side gig. She works long hours and spends most of her time at family events scrolling on her phone, only stepping in to bark orders or criticize someone else. About a week after the barbecue, my mom called me, clearly uncomfortable. She told me she had heard from some extended family members that Gabriella had been saying some nasty things about me. Apparently, she had been telling people I was unfit to be a parent because I was too lenient and that my unstable lifestyle would ruin my kids. She even hinted that someone should call Child Protective Services (CPS) before it was too late. I was stunned. It's one thing to criticize me to my face, but to go behind my back and say things like that, bringing CPS into it, that's a whole new level of betrayal. A few days later, my worst fear came true. There was a knock at the door, and standing there were two CPS workers. They said they had received an anonymous report about unsafe living conditions and neglect. My heart was racing, but I let them in. They were polite but thorough, asking questions about everything from my kids' diet to their sleeping arrangements. They even spoke to my son and daughter who, bless them, were confused but cooperative. After about an hour, the workers told me everything looked fine and they would be closing the case. Still, the experience left me shaken. At the next family event, I decided to confront Gabriella. I didn't accuse her outright, but I asked if she knew anything about the CPS report. She smirked and said something about how people only want what's best for the kids and how sometimes it takes an outsider to see the bigger picture. It took all I had not to scream. My parents were furious when they found out, but refused to cut ties with Gabriella, saying it was important to keep the family together. Rodrigo, of course, stood by his wife, claiming they only acted out of love because I was too selfish to put my kids first. That's when I knew I couldn't trust them. I started keeping a record of everything, every passive-aggressive comment, every questionable thing I noticed about their parenting. At family gatherings, I paid closer attention to their kids, who seemed more withdrawn each time I saw them. I didn't know where this was going, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't let Gabriella and Rodrigo get away with this. Things started to unravel shortly after the CPS visit. One night, as I was going through my messages, I got a notification from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It was an old friend of Rodrigo's, someone who had been close to him before he married Gabriella but had drifted apart. That's when everything began to align in ways I never expected. Rodrigo's old friend's unexpected contact initially seemed harmless, but our conversation left me with a sense that things could change. He told me that before he drifted apart from Rodrigo, he knew some things I would probably find interesting. I didn't have to press much for him to open up. Apparently, Rodrigo had skeletons in his closet. Early in his marriage to Gabriella, he had an affair with one of her co-workers. Although the affair was short-lived, it caused a quiet scandal within Rodrigo's social circle, which was likely the reason he cut ties with this friend. Gabriella knew about the affair but chose to sweep it under the rug to maintain the facade of a perfect couple. It seemed that Gabriella believed their professional success and impeccable social media presence were more important than addressing the real issues in their marriage. This information felt like a key to me. It wasn't just about the affair, but about how far they were willing to manipulate the narrative to appear perfect. I knew I couldn't just use this information directly, but it gave me a new perspective. I started observing Gabriella and Rodrigo more closely, the way Rodrigo interacted with other women, the smiles he gave to female staff at family events, even the comments he made when he thought no one was listening. Slowly, the masks they wore began to crack, at least in my eyes, and I was determined to use this. Meanwhile, I kept documenting everything. At family gatherings, I sat with their children, trying to understand what was happening in their home. The kids seemed tired, wary. It didn't take long for the eldest boy to let slip. "Dad always yells when I mess up," and "Mom never has time to play with me." Those phrases were etched into my memory. I knew something was wrong, but I needed more. It was during a Christmas dinner that things began to unravel for them. Gabriella, as usual, spent most of the event on her phone, ignoring her kids. Rodrigo was visibly irritated, trying to control the situation as the kids began crying for attention. I, on the other hand, stayed quiet, observing everything. When the boy spilled a glass of juice on the table, Rodrigo lost his temper. He shouted so loudly that everyone in the room stopped. The little girl immediately started crying, and Gabriella, instead of stepping in, merely cast a look of disapproval, as if the scene was an inconvenience to her. That was the breaking point for me. In the moment, I said nothing, but it strengthened my resolve. I knew that if it were my family, CPS would have been involved again. So why shouldn't it be the same for them? I decided to act. Using what I had documented and the conversations I had with their children, I contacted a lawyer friend. I explained the situation, and he guided me on how to proceed. I filed a detailed report describing the suffocating environment those kids were being raised in. It wasn't an easy decision. Part of me knew this would cause a huge rift in the family, but another part, the part that remembered the sleepless nights after my own CPS visit, knew it was the right thing to do. It didn't take long for the consequences to start unfolding. A few weeks later, while I was dropping my kids off at school, I received a message from my mother. Gabriella was hysterical because agents were investigating her home. Whether it was irony or poetic justice, it felt like their world was finally crumbling. The agents uncovered much more than I could have imagined. It wasn't just the emotional pressure Rodrigo and Gabriella placed on their kids, but also the peculiar conditions they lived under. While the house appeared pristine for visitors and photos, the children revealed that they spent most of their time in complete silence, terrified of upsetting their parents. The strict rules and constant yelling were suffocating. Rodrigo was called in for questioning, and Gabriella, for the first time, had to face the consequences of her emotional neglect. When the news spread among relatives, Gabriella and Rodrigo's perfect image shattered. My mother tried to mediate the situation, but I was beyond reconciliation. Gabriella tried to confront me, accusing me of destroying her family, but this time, I didn't hold back. I told her everything though she had no right to judge me as a parent when her own household was in shambles, how she used the mask of perfection to hide her flaws, and most importantly, how I would never forgive her for involving CPS against me without valid reasons. The following months were tough for Gabriella and Rodrigo. The CPS investigation revealed that while there was no physical abuse, the emotional environment was harmful to the children. They were mandated to attend family therapy and were supervised by social workers. The kids began spending more time with our parents, which ironically helped them open up more. I continued focusing on my children, determined to give them the home they deserved, but with the satisfaction of knowing that, this time, justice had been served. And Gabriella? Well, she never managed to regain the image she valued so much. Her marriage to Rodrigo began to fall apart, and the criticisms she once directed at me were now aimed at him. It was like watching a house of cards built on lies collapse, and for the first time in years I felt like I could finally breathe in peace. What happened next was a slow but inevitable downward spiral for Gabriella and Rodrigo. The CPS investigation forced them into supervised therapy sessions. However, what should have been an opportunity for them to rebuild became the beginning of the end. Gabriella struggled with being under a microscope, and Rodrigo couldn't handle losing control of the narrative they had worked so hard to maintain. Their marriage started to crumble irreparably. But unlike what Gabriella might have expected, I had no interest in their personal crises. For me, the children were what mattered. Even though they were still in their parents' custody, I knew their living environment had changed. Social workers visited regularly, and Gabriella and Rodrigo's behavior was being closely monitored. They no longer had the luxury of hiding what truly went on. A few months later, during a family gathering, my mother tried to convince me to reconcile with Gabriella. According to her, the family needed to stay united. Gabriella, sensing the chance to make herself the center of attention, seized the moment to try to flip the narrative once again. With a cynical smile, she said, "If you had focused on improving your own life instead of trying to ruin mine, maybe you wouldn't have wasted so much time." I didn't hold back. Ruin your life? Gabriella, you did that yourself. You chose to prioritize your image over your children. You decided it was more important to appear perfect than to actually be a good mother. And instead of taking responsibility for your mistakes, you attacked me. You threw stones at my house without realizing yours was made of glass. She tried to argue, but for the first time, the people around us weren't on her side. Rodrigo, usually silent in these situations, looked visibly uncomfortable. It was no longer possible to sweep the truth under the rug, and everyone knew it. Gabriella began raising her voice, but my mother, who had always been lenient with her, interrupted. "Gabriella, enough. You need to stop blaming others for the consequences of your choices." That moment was a shock. My mother, who had always tried to keep the peace, finally acknowledged what everyone already knew. Gabriella wasn't a victim of anything except her own actions. A few months later, the news began to spread. Gabriella and Rodrigo's marriage officially ended. During their divorce proceedings, details that had only been whispered among relatives came to light. Rodrigo tried to use Gabriella's failings against her to gain an advantage in the division of assets, while Gabriella did the same to him. Both were willing to play dirty, but in the end, there wasn't much left for either of them. The house was sold to pay off debts, and the children were sent to live with my parents while their parents tried to piece their lives back together. I, on the other hand, was in a better place than ever. My kids thrived in a home filled with love and freedom. I had managed to expand my work as a graphic designer and was finally in a comfortable position, both financially and emotionally. It hadn't been easy to get there, but every step was a reminder that I had done what was right. Gabriella attempted to reach out to me a few times. Vague messages, usually disguised as apologies, but never truly sincere. I ignored them. Surprisingly, Rodrigo did the same. Perhaps he realized, far too late, that Gabriella had never been as perfect as he believed. A few years later, I saw Gabriella and Rodrigo's kids again at a family reunion organized by my mother. They seemed happier, more relaxed. They even thanked me shyly for everything I had done. That's when I realized that despite all the chaos, what truly mattered was that they were okay. Somehow, I had managed to protect not only my own kids but theirs as well. As I watched them playing in the backyard with my children, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. Gabriella and Rodrigo had destroyed themselves, but the impact of their choices wouldn't last forever. The children still had a chance at something better. In the end, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't an act of hate. It was a fight for the truth, for what was right. I lost a lot in the process, but I also gained something invaluable, the certainty that I did everything I could to protect those who needed it. And for me, that was enough.